Developed by Darkworks and published in 2005 by Ubisoft, Cold Fear was an action horror game in the same vein as Resident Evil. And I mean, to be specific, Resident Evil 4. Because despite a difference in developers and publishers, Cold Fear is sort of like if Capcom told Ubisoft they could copy their homework, but, you know, maybe change a couple of things so it isn't too obvious.
They're the same picture.
But despite the actual gameplay similarities, like an over-the-shoulder combat view, a laser reticle, and a blonde protagonist, Cold Fear and Resident Evil 4 are leagues apart when it comes to quality.
Yeah, I hear you.
And what I mean is that Resident Evil 4 was actually good. Except that's not totally fair, because Cold Fear does actually have some interesting mechanics and a plot that has promise at the start, along with combat that ain't half bad.
Hey, that's pretty good.
Cold Fear takes place out in the middle of the ocean and has the player take control of Tom Hansen of the US Coast Guard as he responds to a distress call from a whaling ship. And upon boarding the ship, he finds that everything is, to put it bluntly, completely fucked.
Help me! Holy...
A bunch of Russians have gone and got themselves infected with some sort of parasite that attaches itself to the brain, essentially turning them into brain-dead zombies. And I mean, outside of the ocean setting, this is essentially what happens in Resident Evil 4. In that game, a parasite unearthed from deep underground infects the local villagers, turning them into zombies that are still capable of basic functions like swinging an axe or, in some cases, using a firearm. And here, it's shockingly the same, with a parasite found deep in the ocean, doing the exact same thing, infecting the workers and leaving them able to do no more than swing a weapon, and yeah, in some cases, fire a rifle. Over the course of the game, Hansen works to uncover what's going on, as well as try to get himself and Anna, another survivor, to safety. And you'll do this by exploring the environment, collecting notes and supplies, as well as blasting every enemy you see along the way. And I think the actual core narrative is easily the weakest part of the experience, because it's virtually non-existent. There are cutscenes as well as radio comms, but these just sort of serve to tell the player what to do next. And it actually feels like there were supposed to be way more cutscenes, but they just sort of never made it into the full game. Or maybe another way to put it is that the game's narrative was built entirely around the environment and the gameplay, and really just came as an afterthought.
Hey, he's right! Yeah!
For example, partway into the game, Hansen and Anna are infected with the parasite, exactly like Leon and Ashley in RE4, I might add. And Hansen's mission at this point becomes to find an antidote, except he only finds one, and he uses it on her.
So this is it, Tom. 2 patients, 1 cure.
And at this point, I expected to play as Anna after he collapses and maybe find a way to try to save him too, but no. He wakes up and proceeds with his mission of just finding evidence.
I'm on it, Chief. Antidote file is incoming.
Got it. What's next?
And it's worth pointing out that after he wakes up, Anna is just sort of gone. And I don't know if this was a bug and she was supposed to be on the table, but she isn't. Well, anyways, at the end of the game, the two make their escape to a happily ever after, and the game just sort of ends.
That's it?
I'm assuming Hansen was infected. In fact, they show it happening twice.
20 minutes later.
Should they be worried? Is Hansen gonna be chest bursted during this helicopter ride? Dude, fuck if I know. They also attempt to create some sort of relationship between the two, as if they've known each other longer, but I mean, they haven't. So when they act all worried about each other, it just kind of comes off as forced. Again, like most of the cutscenes where their relationship grows were just cut.
Have you located the notes? Screw the notes. Those things just infected Anna.
I don't give a fuck.
Most of the actual substance of the plot is found in notes, similar to, Resident Evil. But the notes mostly just explain how the parasite functions. And to the game's credit, all of that stuff is actually pretty good. Like, it seems most of the writing just went into how the parasite works, how it evolves, and how it infects hosts.
Brother,
And all of it does seem well thought out, and it's actually pretty interesting. But as far as the main plot goes, to say it's threadbare feels a bit too generous. And as far as the characters, again, man, there's just no real substance. I mean, Tom Hansen is just a black hole of a character. I think I could maybe best compare him to Ethan Winters in Resident Evil 7. He's just sort of a conduit to usher the player through scenarios and situations. But because there are so few cutscenes and radio chatter is just him being fed an objective, he has no room to really be fleshed out.
Yeah, I hear you.
And Anna has no personality to speak of outside of just being Russian.
Don't come back, Anna. It's too dangerous.
Hush, I am coming back and I'm bringing help.
And look, man, I like Russian female protagonists. Shout out to my girl Natalia.
Wake me up when you're ready for re-entry.
But Anna is just nothing. She serves no purpose other than for Tom to save her and to be a convenient way for them to escape.
If it's working, I can fly us out of here.
You learned to fly a chopper?
I had to do something with my time here.
Beautiful. I'm on my way.
Oh, well, that's convenient.
So, I mean, I don't even know what else to say about the story, other than it seems that there was one at some point, but it's just been rewritten and ripped out to the point of simply no longer existing. But before I get to gameplay, it is worth mentioning the visuals. Even for a 2005 game, Cold Fear is really bland with flat textures and washed out environments. And I get that it takes place on a ship during a storm, so it's gonna be, dark and gray. But this could have been a chance to do something with lighting or color and other environmental details, but they just sort of didn't do anything interesting. The only real praise I can give it is that when you're on deck, the actual effect of the rain when you move the camera does look pretty good, with the rain actually being pretty realistic when you angle it at the camera from where it's coming from.
Impressive. Very nice.
Now, when it comes to gameplay, this is where Cold Fear is at its best, but even then, it ain't perfect. While the combat camera is over the shoulder, similar to, Resident Evil 4, when you navigate the environments, the camera stays at fixed angles most of the time, just like how the earlier Resident Evil games played. And for the most part, I actually like this. I enjoy fixed camera angles in horror. It worked in Resident Evil and Silent Hill, as well as newer games like Until Dawn. And it really works here when the environments are these dark, claustrophobic halls on a tanker or an oil rig. And for the most part, it works well in tandem with the combat camera. Because despite those fixed angles, Hansen actually controls with a more modern feel rather than the tank controls that you might expect. This allows him to turn fluidly and for you to aim and immediately be right on target. And while the Resident Evil style fixed camera angles work, the actual navigation is honestly, it's downright terrible. The two areas you play in, the ship and the rig, are both fairly large with intertwining rooms and halls. There are plenty of locked doors, oftentimes in need of the proper key. And like, yeah, all of this is standard for a game like this. But what isn't standard is the lack of a goddamn map.
He's right, you know.
I hope you have absolute perfect memory. Otherwise, get ready to walk around the same halls and rooms trying to remember where you have and haven't fucking been. The lack of any sort of functional map has got to be the single worst design decision of Cold Fear.
He's right, you know.
Cold Fear isn't terribly long, but I expect 2 out of the 7 hours it took me to finish it were just me wandering the same rooms trying to remember where the fuck to go. And at the beginning of the game, Hansen remarks about how everything is in Russian, you know, being on a Russian ship, and how he hopes he remembers enough of it to get by. But he will never remark on what a door or hallway sign says to let you know where you are or where you're going. You can't interact with a sign and have it tell you that you're in the mess hall or anything like that. And so navigating these environments becomes an absolute test of patience and memory, both of which I personally have in short supply.
It's true, but he shouldn't say it.
But say that maybe my lack of memory is total skill issue. Fair. It still brings me to my next point, which is interactivity in the environments, or lack thereof. In both Silent Hill and Resident Evil, players can interact with objects and remark on what's going on. This can give context to a situation or create even more immersion in the environment. You can't do anything with the environment here, and I found it frustrating to no end. You're telling me these computers have no interesting lore or notes? I mean, what the hell are these VATs? Give me a description of anything, please. It's like the developers at Darkworks wanted to make a Resident Evil game, but didn't want to put any effort at all into making it any good. It feels like it must have been $4.59 on a Friday during every single minute of development.
He ain't lying.
So, no map and no environmental descriptions. What about puzzles? I mean, even Resident Evil 4 had puzzles. Well, there are exactly 0 puzzles in Cold Fear. No code keys to figure out, no parts that need to be combined, nothing.
It's pathetic.
And I mean, I guess action horror games don't need puzzles. Sure. Take The Suffering, for example. It has no real puzzles to speak of, but it also wasn't acting as a Resident Evil clone. So for Cold Fear to have absolutely no puzzles is honestly pretty astounding.
Pathetic.
At the very least, what I can say is actually pretty good is the combat. Combat in Cold Fear is, like its other aspects, extremely similar to Resident Evil 4. Like I said before, you have that over-the-shoulder camera allowing you to easily target enemies, and you have that laser reticle for almost every weapon. And you actually amass quite an arsenal by the end of the game. You start with a handgun, but you quickly get access to an AK-47, a shotgun, and a harpoon gun that attracts enemies. And later on, you'll get a grenade launcher, an MP5, and a flamethrower.
Welcome to hell, motherfucker!
And all of these are pretty excellent to use, honestly. They sound decent enough and can put almost all enemies down in a reasonable amount of time. The shotgun can send enemies flying back, and the pistol is a perfect all-rounder, and the flamethrower can just downright cook groups of enemies. But again, kind of like how there's a lack of map and inspections, there's only one reload animation, and it's pulling the slide back on the handgun, you know, like to rechamber around. But I'm not saying that you can only reload the handgun. What I'm saying is that you're gonna be pulling the slide back on every weapon.
Let's see that in an instant replay.
You do this with the AK-47, the shotgun, the MP5, everything. I mean, they couldn't have even added a shell loading animation. It's honestly astoundingly lazy. But, like, look, lazy reload animations aside, I actually think all of the weapons are fun when you're actually using them. And a lot of this is thanks to the enemies you fight. Over the course of the game, you'll fight your standard zombies, which are similar to the Ganados in Resident Evil 4, often wielding various weapons. But then you've also got actual humans with rifles, parasites that can infect corpses, big brute enemies that only work out one arm, I guess. As well as invisible enemies and these weird dog-type guys. And despite being a horror game, I actually found the humans to be the most fun when I fought them. They hide behind cover, but often near explosive barrels, and blowing them up was always satisfying. And several times you'll actually find them fighting off hordes of zombies, allowing you to absolutely lay waste to everything nearby. I mentioned that they hunker down next to barrels, but there are plenty of other environmental hazards you can use against enemies. Oftentimes you can electrocute enemies in water by shooting fuse boxes, or catch them on fire by shooting these red valves. And the combination of those hazards with the weapons and enemy types really makes for a pretty satisfying third-person shooter. In fact, several times I found myself wishing I was using these mechanics just in a better game. The gore effects are really good as well. The zombies require you to actually score a headshot to put them down for good, and as you take their head off with a shot, blood sprays on the screen as well as all over the wall. It's really good, honestly. And since this is an action horror game, combat is frequent, and I found myself always looking forward to another encounter, another chance to, lay into enemies with the shotgun or the AK. And it's worth mentioning too that the combat itself isn't terribly difficult. You don't have an inventory or an item box to hoard resources, but enemies can still be searched for ammo and health and often provide exactly what you need. Oftentimes I'd be low on health and the next body I searched would have a med kit. But there are also plenty of items just laying around waiting to be snatched up. The only times I really died were to environmental hazards, and often those were my own fault, to be fair. And speaking of environmental hazards, it's worth mentioning that when on the surface of either the ship or the rig, they have these sort of rolling effects. And yeah, I see what they're going for. They want you to feel like you're in this terrible storm with Hansen struggling to stay on his feet, something he'll have even more trouble doing if you run his stamina out. But this effect is just kind of terrible, and I can see it making some poor gamer's lunch come right back up. And I actually think that's a good way of summing this whole game up. Not that it made my lunch come back up, but that I can see what they were trying to do. In every single aspect, I can see what they attempted to do. They wanted Resident Evil, but on the open sea. And funnily enough, Resident Evil would actually go on to do that with the absolutely excellent Resident Evil Revelations. They tried to have the fixed camera angles and claustrophobic interiors, you have monster enemies, backtracking, and an evil research lab, but in all of these aspects, they totally botched their attempt. The story is threadbare and the map is non-existent. There are no puzzles or interactable environments outside of combat, and it's a real shame because the combat can be a lot of fun. And I know people are sick of remakes, I get it, I do. But because I can see the potential in the entirety of this, I kind of hope that this gets a remake one day. And if anyone were to say that they love this game, I kind of get it. I can also see that if somebody says it's absolutely terrible, yeah, I get it. But man, as I see it now, I don't think it's terrible. But I don't think it's very good either. I think it's a great third-person shooter, kind of trapped in an awful horror game. And for me, it actually sits in the worst possible position it could be in, which is that Cold Fear isn't terrible, it's just disappointing and forgettable.